my talk. Here we go. How he said he living life as a gringo. Where you question where you fit in every time you mingle. They say you do this with not enough that. My rapping is really bad. This life as a gringo.
Yes, hello and welcome to another episode of Life as a Gringo. I am Dramos, of course, and it's Thursday, so it means it's time for our Thursday Trends episode. Flying solo on today's show, but man, what a week of events that it's been. I think, as is typical, unfortunately, in the news cycle, the world that we live in, I guess life in general. You can have these beautiful moments of celebration, or at least a lot of people are celebrating, in the form of one of the stories that we're going to be talking about today, with President Biden dropping out of the upcoming presidential election, him not seeking re-election, and endorsing his vice president Kamala Harris as the potential Democratic nominee, and a lot of great responses around that, which we'll get into. And then one of the other stories, unfortunately, on the flip side of it, a story that has been far too common, is a unnecessary death at the hands of police, and is a stark reminder, I think, of the world that we still live in. As much as we get these little tidbits of progress, and they are beautiful moments, there's also just so much work to be done. So we'll dive into both of those, and then on a positive note, in our Mi Gente segment, we'll talk about a new short film that Apple is bringing out, that is based on, I guess, I'm not Mexican, so I'm not completely versed on this, but based on a Mexican game that a lot of people play growing up. Either way, great representation for our communities as a whole, so we'll honor that. And then for our Ask a Gringo segment, I'll get y'all's take on one of the topics at hand. But before that, man, let's just dive into the nonsense, the BS, as we always do in a segment called For the People in the Back.
Say it louder for the people in the back. Say it louder for the people in the back.
All right, so we'll start in a lighter place here. One of the big stories, obviously, coming out of this last week, it happened over this last weekend. You had President Biden announcing that he would no longer be seeking re-election, and that he was putting his endorsement behind Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast, or even just, I guess, on the internet in general, a lot of people, yours truly, were calling for Biden to step down and to stop seeking re-election, especially after that debate performance, but even before then. And it sucks that it took this long, because, really, there's only weeks left in the campaign trail, essentially. If I'm not mistaken, early voting begins at the end of September. So really not much time to kind of formulate a campaign for the Democrats and do all the things necessary and needed to potentially win this upcoming election. And I think part of that blame is both on Democrats and Joe Biden as a whole, who were not listening to their constituents, the people, calling for something new, something different. And I think the reaction we've seen from Kamala Harris being announced as Joe Biden's would-be predecessor, potentially, the excitement and energy has completely sort of flipped on its head, and the momentum has gone in favor of the Democrats. I mean, Kamala Harris has raised $126 million in donations since Sunday, and this includes $81 million in just the first 24 hours since Biden's exit, making it the largest one-day fundraising haul for any candidate, according to the campaign. And I think that really speaks to how frustrated people were that the Democrats were wheeling out old Joe again, and how he was really digging his foot or his toe or whatever the saying is into the dirt. and not wanting to bow out gracefully, right? And again, the will of the people having been done, and we're seeing this positive reaction to it for the most part, right? Obviously, it's going to be the naysayers, but for the most part, it's re-energized the Democratic base, you know? And on the other side of that, I have to give respect where respect is due, right? I mean, let's be real. We all have egos, and to publicly have to sort of admit defeat in this manner, and to publicly have to step down after you were so adamant that you weren't going to, and that you were the best person for the job, Joe Biden put his own personal ego aside and put the country first. And to that, I really do respect him. I can only imagine how difficult it was to make that decision, to you know, understand the ridicule that is probably going to come as a result of that, and also maybe the question marks that some may place on your legacy. But truthfully, I think this sort of is the differentiating factor between Democrats and Republicans as a whole. And I'm speaking generally here, but the Democrats, when push comes to shove, and they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, by any metrics really, but when push comes to shove, they have proven they will not only respect democracy, but they're going to put the best interest of the country first. Donald Trump, without a doubt, would never have done this. Right? In fact, many could argue he sort of held his party hostage and beat them into submission of having to back him, essentially. And I think that's the glaring difference, you know. And I hear other people's sort of arguments on this whole thing, right? The Democrats, other Democrats who maybe Kamala wasn't your first choice. And to be quite honest, she wasn't my first choice either. Gavin Newsom would have been my first choice. And I get how you could have wanted to have a regular process. And technically speaking, she is not the official candidate just yet, although according to a AP survey, they're saying that she has secured enough support from Democratic delegates to become the party's nomination. But I do understand the frustration that maybe some people on the left who tend to vote Democrat are feeling, where it's like you're getting this candidate pushed on you. And I think a lot of people also pointing to the 2020 election where she dropped out of the race fairly early. And I hear that. I see that. I think we have to keep two things in mind here. A, what's at stake for our country in this election? I mean, there's already been tons of talk about that Project 2025, and you can look that up, and so many scary things and ideals that are being pushed within that. I mean, shit, the RNC, the Republican National Convention, scary ideals being pushed, a lot of hate still being pushed. I can't remember the congressman's name, but one of the Republican congressmen talking about a potential civil war. Just a lot of really negative rhetoric, obviously a lot of anti-immigrant talk happening from the Republicans. And I think we have to really take into consideration the repercussions of this election. And I'm not saying we have to be happy about it, right? Happy about the position that we find ourselves in. But I think, as in anything in life, you can't be fixated on the idealized version of how you want things to be. That doesn't mean you don't do the work. It doesn't mean you don't do your best to try to get there. But you also have to live in the real world and make decisions based upon real world circumstances. And the real world circumstance here is that the Republican Party has gone off the rails and are really trying to push forward an incredibly hateful agenda that would set this country back and maybe not even leave us with a real country moving forward. There's already been a lot of acknowledgement and, back patting of dictators throughout the world and implications of Donald Trump loving that idea, right? Him celebrating people like Putin from Russia. And that's really what's at stake. And I think what is happening with the Democratic Party, because of the time constraints, any would-be potential Democratic candidates are kind of just falling in line because they understand that for the greater good of the mission of this country, of this experiment that is the United States of America, the best thing to do in the sort of time constraint we find ourselves in is to all get behind Kamala Harris and do our best to get her into office. Because, again, we've already seen what happens with a radicalized Supreme Court like we have. You know, we have a split between the House and the Senate of one being controlled by Democrats, one being controlled by Republicans. And just all the chaos that has happened even with women's reproductive rights. You know, there's so much more on the docket than I think we can even really wrap our brains around potentially. And I'm not trying to fearmonger or anything like that. I just think this is the reality of the situation. And again, she's not my first choice. But also, with that said, as somebody who said, you know, that's not really who I wanted, watching her over these last few days, she feels very presidential. And seeing the obvious, the donations and all that stuff happening, people are rallying behind her. You could feel the excitement, the energy. I felt personally like just a weight was lifted off my shoulders when this was announced. And she gets it in a way that the Biden-led campaign didn't. Right? Whoever's doing her marketing and her social media and all this stuff, like, they are tapped into the younger generation. And that's what gives me hope. Because they're getting the younger generation excited. Right? They're doing like the whole brat summer, like Kamala is a brat, which is a thing. It's the name of Charlie XCX's album, and it's like this just theme of like, you know, whatever, women's empowerment and freedom and fun, basically. But it's like, you know, as a DJ in the club, I recognize like it's a movement. I'm always getting people requesting her music from that album. It's big in the queer community. It's big with the younger generation. And we saw it. There was, I was watching MSNBC last night, and there was a statistic they reported, and if I'm not mistaken, it was something like there were 40,000 new registered voters as a result of Kamala Harris's announcement, 80% of them being between the ages of 18 to 35. And that's what we want. We want an energized, younger base to begin to push out this older generation that keeps doing things to set us back or is holding us back from progressing into the country that we need to be moving forward. The one that looks out for people like you and I. And I think also the other narrative that I hate that is being pushed around is this idea of Kamala Harris being like a DEI hire, or it's like identity politics, or whatever the case may be. Let us not forget, this is a highly educated woman, a highly decorated attorney, and successful attorney at that. I mean, you know, if this was like my daughter, sister, wife, cousin, anybody, I would be so fucking proud of her accomplishments. I mean, and then again, you know, rising to the national ranks to be a presidential candidate, and then being the vice president, and also being Attorney General of the state of California, which is I believe it's the third largest economy in the world. Like, you know, it competes with every other country, basically. You know, and for a presidential candidate, she's fairly young. She's 59. She's got a lot of energy. She is great on the mic. I've seen a lot of growth, I feel like, from her speaking. watching her speak, watching her riff and play off of the audience, I couldn't help but make a comparison to someone like President Obama, who was incredibly charismatic and great on the mic and great at ad-libbing and riffing and following the energy of the crowd and being enthusiastic in that manner. And even her campaign slogan that seemingly kind of fell into her lap from the crowd of it being, we're not going back, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's all a great sort of perfect storm for Democrats to potentially win this election in a sort of must-win situation when you talk about the future of our country. So I think that's what we have to kind of take into consideration. And again, I get the frustration if she's not your first choice as far as candidate goes, but we have bigger fish to fry, as they say, right? And to be quite fair, she is a very impressive human being and candidate. And I think one can't argue with the lived experience that she's had over the last almost 4 years working beside Joe Biden, someone who's been in office for whatever, like 100 years at this point almost, it seems like. And I think you're seeing that. I feel like, I was privy when during like the last election campaign that I was working at the Breakfast Club. So we had all the candidates, as far as the Democrats go, on the show. Not many Republicans wanted to come on, but we had Kamala there in person. If I'm not mistaken, she was there twice. And I always liked her. Again, it wasn't my first choice, even in that. Like, I was Team Bernie for a long time. But I feel like I've been closely sort of watching, and I can't help but feel like I've seen a lot of growth in her sort of taking on the, I don't know, they call it like looking very presidential, right? Her presidentialness that I feel like is exuding from her right now in this moment. And that's exciting to me. And again, the fact that younger people in this country are now energized about this election, people of color being energized about it, and regardless of your politics or specific issues you may agree or disagree on with her, we should never be putting down also like that other narrative. Like, I see a lot of people of color on the internet trying to put her down in different ways. They call her a cop and all these different things. This is an impressive human being. Or people saying, I don't see the country wanting to vote for a black person or a woman of color. This represents so much, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. If elected, the sort of, I feel like doors that would just break down culturally, societally in this country would be epic, is the word that comes to mind. To see not only a woman holding title of president, but a woman of color. Like, the optics alone are incredibly inspiring and can't sort of help but make you feel like the future of this world can be far brighter than maybe it's felt like for the last few years. So that's sort of my take on it. And, anybody who is a little flustered by this whole process, I hope that maybe brings some new ideas to your head. And not for nothing, but like, administration has been doing work. In the second quarter, the U.S. economy grew 2.8%, right? All this talk about the economy and something they're doing is working. And I get it. It's like the everyday person, it doesn't feel like it. And I do understand that frustration. I think a lot of that, in my opinion, is corporate greed in general. And that does need to be reprimanded. But there are a lot of things happening. I'm riffing now off of a podcast I was listening to, but even things like airlines, right? Like I complain a lot about airlines. I don't know if I've done it as much on the podcast. In my personal life, it's one of my biggest gripes because I feel like they take advantage of us because we have very few options. But even within that, you have, Pete Buttigieg. His job is to look over transportation in this country, to oversee it, and he's passed a mandate on the airlines as far as them reimbursing people. And again, I'm riffing right now off of the top of my head of remembering what I was listening to on the podcast, but basically making it so people have to be reimbursed quickly for airline failures or cancellations and things of that nature, like really trying to hold them accountable. And he's publicly called out airlines like Delta, who have been slow to recover after the tech outage that happened last week, and all these planes were grounded, right? So again, it's not perfect. Again, we're still being hit where it hurts. It feels like constantly, but it does seem like attention is beginning to be placed in the right places. And for that, you have to be a bit excited, or even if you're not excited, at least borderline optimistic of the potential future we all could be living in. And I, for one, am excited about this. And again, as something as stupid as like the Charlie XCX brat thing, that is proof right there that her campaign is meeting people where they are, and that's what we need. Most people, and I'm not shaming anybody, a lot of people don't even have the time or space to really dive into politics and to, sit around watching it all day or whatever it might be. Or there's just so many other things going on, and your brain is just going to other places. You're looking for relief and release in other places. I get it. So it's up to politicians to meet us where we are right now and speak our language. And that's the only way you're going to get us activated, enthusiastic, and involved. And again, when I see things like that, embracing the brat thing, that is her meeting people where they are so that they can be energized and now have a seat at the table. And I think that's sort of what has been missing before, and one of my bigger critiques. And it's why somebody like AOC was able to, run a grassroots campaign and become the figure that she is, because of her ability to speak to the younger audience, the future of this country, and get them energized and excited. And that's what Kamala is doing right now. And that's what has me excited about this moment right here. Now, warning, we're going to get into a triggering story, a dark story. So I'm going to warn you right now. Before we do that, though, we'll take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. All right, we are back, and again, warning on this story. It's not a fun one for me to talk about, but it's a necessary one to talk about, and that is the fatal shooting of a black woman in Illinois named Sonia Massey. And, I mean, to be fair, because I'm like thinking to myself, the George Floyd movement, and a part of me is like, man, we're still going through this event after all that happened with George Floyd and incident after incident. But there is, I think, some progress being made as far as accountability. Now, obviously, there's a ways to go, and we'll kind of get to I'll get to the story first, and then I'll kind of spin back into that. But there's a little bit of a silver lining, as much as there can be, when you have a story of a woman losing her life unnecessarily, a person losing their life unnecessarily. And I'll touch on that at the end. But the story at hand, right? So you have a 36-year-old black woman named Sonia Massey who called 911 for assistance at her home. You had Sean Grayson, who is 14 months into his career as a deputy sheriff for the Sangamon County. And he's being charged with murder in Massey's death. And this, I'm reading from an Associated Press article. They say, the latest example of law enforcement officers shooting black people in their homes across the country. Now, the silver lining, him being charged quickly. If you recall the George Floyd case, literally George Floyd was murdered, and it took months and months. It took for the video to be leaked on the internet, for public outcry to happen, in order for this man to be charged, the Derek Chauvin. And that's another talking point that I feel like we forget about a lot, right? Just like a pause here for a second. Because I always see on like the rhetoric of people on the right is like, this idea of, well, look how they took to the streets and burned it down. That's how they decided to have their voice heard. And it's like, bro, that's the only thing that made you listen. Unfortunately, I'm like the last person who supports violence in that manner. But literally, this was like a closed case. The report was filed months later. All of a sudden, the video comes out. Then, all of a sudden, people are like, oh, shit, we should probably look back into this. And it took rioting in the streets and all these things for these officers to be arrested. They spent months at home. And if that video never hit the internet, if the pandemic hadn't happened where we're all sitting around bored and looking for things and constantly, checking social media more than maybe we would have otherwise, had it not been for that, that story probably never would have gotten the national attention, and these guys would still be walking around the streets, not being responsible for the murder of George Floyd. So, unfortunately, that is what happens when you ignore people and you don't give them their proper rights. Now I don't know why I got sometimes you like look at TikTok comments on things and it's just like, man, can people really be this fucking stupid? So that was me discussing that. Anyway, back to this article. So they're gonna give us the timeline and kind of what they know about the shooting thus far. So 12:50 a.m. on July 6th, Massey called 911 with her fears about a prowler around her home in an unincorporated neighborhood of Springfield, 200 miles southeast of Chicago. Video from the body cameras warned by Grayson and another deputy show a search around Massey's house and in surrounding yards. They found a black SUV with broken windows in an adjacent driveway before Massey came to the front door. When Massey opened the door, she said, quote, "Don't hurt me," seemed to be confused and repeated, "Please God," and said, quote, "I don't know what to do." Grayson asked her for her name to include on a report as the deputies prepared to leave. Massey was searching for her purse for her ID when Grayson pointed out a pot of water over a flame on the stove. Massey quickly went to the stove, moved the pan towards a sink, and asked Grayson, "Where are you going?" He had stepped back and remained in the living room of the small home, separated from her by a cluttered counter. Grayson and Massey chuckled as he replied, "Away from your hot, steaming water." Massey then unexpectedly said, quote, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus," prompting Grayson to pull his 9mm pistol and tell her, "You better expletive not, or I swear to God I'll expletive shoot you in the expletive face." He repeatedly yelled at Massey to put down the pot. She apologized and ducked before Grayson fired 3 times, striking Massey once in the head. Let's just pause for a second. This woman doesn't have a gun in her hand, doesn't have a knife, has a pot in it that apparently has boiling water. Okay. I could get why you are being a bit careful of that. That's fine. Being aware of your surroundings. I can understand her yelling out, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus," being a strange thing for somebody to yell at you and to sort of put you on high alert. Even pulling out your pistol, I could try and see it. If you really felt she was getting ready to lunge at you and you're trying to scare her to stop, I can try to see it. But from there, if you are telling her multiple times to put down the pot, why not, instead of standing in the same exact spot, if you're that concerned, why aren't you making your way out the door or out of the range of this potential water being thrown at you, if that's what you're so scared of? Instead, you chose to stand your ground and scream at the person when, again, you could have easily de-escalated by just moving out of range of this. And then if she runs at you in some, then it's like, okay, maybe there's a conversation to be had in some sort of way. But no, nothing about this is a logical response. And then also shooting her in the head. A kill shot. And I know the counter argument to that is, well, in the heat of the moment, you're just aiming to hit a body part. But the largest body part you could possibly hit on a person would be the chest. But you're aiming for a guaranteed almost kill shot in the head. You can't argue against that. Now, a grand jury has indicted Grayson on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated battery with a firearm, and official misconduct. If convicted, he faces prison sentences of 45 years to life for murder, 6 to 30 years for battery, and 2 to 5 years for misconduct. He's being held in Menard County Jail without bond. He pleaded not guilty, and his defense attorney has declined to comment on the case. Now, when I talk about silver lining, again, the George Floyd murder took months for anybody to be arrested and indicted. It took actually, riots happening in the street and public outrage around the world. Here, at least, he's been indicted immediately, being held in jail without bond, so he's not getting to sit in his comfortable home as the other officers did in that George Floyd case. He's being brought up on serious charges. On top of that, he was fired the day that he was indicted. So, while we very obviously have a problem with pick your angle you want to take with this, any of them probably fit. People being police officers who shouldn't be police officers, lack of training, racism inherently ingrained in them, whether it's conscious or subconscious, whatever it might be. But at least there's accountability, right? That part we're beginning to get better on. Again, for the family of this poor woman, Sonia Massey, or Macy, I apologize if I'm messing up her name. For her family, I'm sure it's not much of a consolation. They lost somebody they love. She is a mother of two. And again, all this could be avoided. And if we're getting better at solving the problem of holding these police officers accountable when they commit misconduct and blatant murder in this case, that's great. But where are we on the very glaring problem of, be it lack of training, be it lack of character, or blind hatred? Where are we on the vetting process, the training process? And I think that is the glaring question that continues to repeat itself, 4 years after the murder of George Floyd, and case after case, unfortunately. And also, can you imagine you call the police because you're fearful that somebody's breaking into your home and you end up dead? It just sounds crazy to even say out loud. Yeah, I called the police. And then I ended up, and then you ended up being the one shot. Just wild to even think about. And again, lack of training. They did mention that she's actually somebody who had struggled with mental illness and had actually undergone treatment. So again, lack of training as far as mental health concerns or just education in general. Right? Perhaps if this officer had training in dealing with people with potential mental health issues, he wouldn't have taken those words of hers as such a threat. Now, moving on in the article, they say in last week's court hearing, First Assistant State's Attorney Mary Beth Rogers said the distance between Grayson and Macy negated any perceived threat, and he had, quote, a lot of options aside from firing his weapon if he believed he was in danger. Exactly. Quote, at no point did this defendant show anything but callousness towards human life, adding that Grayson, quote, clearly dismissed his training as a law enforcement officer. Now, on the video, Grayson is heard justifying his actions by saying, quote, what else do we do? I'm not taking expletive boiling water to the expletive face. He's also heard telling arriving officers that Macy, quote, came at me and called her, quote, crazy. Now, again, this is the bullshit. She came at me, right? That's the famous thing they love to sort of say. Now, thank God, body camera footage is available. That the other deputy had their body camera footage on and had a clear view of what happened. But again, what if we didn't have social media for all these stories to be shared, right? What if George Floyd hadn't happened, that perfect storm of COVID and boredom and just social unrest? Someone like Grayson potentially would have walked away from this with a slap on the wrist, would have written a report that stated his life was in danger, and everybody would have moved on with their life, except for the innocent victim who was killed, Sonia Macy, and her family, who are now mourning a loved one unnecessarily. So it's, I guess it's a stark reminder that there's still a lot of progress to be made when it comes to police interactions, and I think policing in general in the United States. And I bring up this case, I talk about it, and I appreciate people sharing it on social media, because I think what oftentimes happens with a lot of this stuff, we begin to normalize it and we get numb to it, and we don't give it the attention it deserves because we don't perceive it as egregious as it actually is. And then what will happen is the same old shit will just keep happening because we become numb to it. Sadly, similar to what happens with school shootings and how people are justifying, having guns and all these things. I mean, shit, I was just, off the cuff here, was listening to a news podcast, I think it was yesterday. They were talking about how there's now bullet vending machines and how the vending machines don't do background checks. So anybody with a driver's license could get these bullets, basically. Even if they have, no license to have a firearm or anything like that, as long as they have a driver's license, they can buy bullets from a local grocery store. I believe it was in Texas. That was the first one to have this vending machine. So just a weird dystopian society we live in where we're numbing ourselves to tragedy, and that's why we can't just ignore stories like this one, or we can't not speak about them. It's important to continue to recognize how egregious situations like this one are and how much change and progress is really still needed in the realm of law enforcement and its interactions with the everyday people, particularly black people and people of color in general, where the statistics are just staggering. Now, with that said, we're going to shift into some positive stuff here in our Mi Gente segment. Mi Gente. All All right, so we have a new short film from Apple called Suerte, and it follows Mexican-American singer-songwriter Ivan Cornejo, 20 years old, as he travels to his ancestral land in search of musical inspiration. While there, he is confronted by a horde of unlikely characters: the devil, a fish, a mermaid, a skeleton, and a frog. Cornejo's dreamland is actually a game of Mexican loteria come to life, where he and each card's character help the 20-year-old find the corazon in his songwriting. Now, what's crazy about this, I mean, amazing. Love to see it get the platform it deserves, and an artist who has a vision like this, Ivan Cornejo, being able to see his vision come to life. And he's also a actual singer, so there's a real song of his attached to it. So beautiful to see him get the platform and partnership in somebody like Apple, which I've dipped my toe into the world of, like, you know, film and television, and it's not easy to get shit made by big studios. So that's why I make it a point to celebrate when things like this happen and to try to support with my viewership. And what's actually really cool about this, and even more inspiring, and why I always sort of harp on the idea of, like, don't overthink your goals or your dreams or the things you want to do and feel like, you know, you have to wait for the perfect moment or wait to have the perfect equipment. He actually shot this on an iPhone, right? And again, in the article, this will be Army too, they talk about how this shows you how democratic present-day filmmaking can be, right? Something all of us could do. Almost all of us are lucky enough to have an iPhone. Now, they go on to say the movie is a notable celebration of Latinidad while making no pomp and circumstances of where Cornejo grew up, what language he mostly speaks, or where the film is set. Cornejo, born in Riverside, California to Mexican parents, is neither aquí ni allá, right? The idea of being from neither here nor there. That's what the premise of this podcast is. Living comfortably in English and Spanish within and across the border. Suerte may be set in Mexico, but it equally traverses the singer's dreamscape. Let's call it the Loteria Land. I think I pronounced that. Loteria Land, yeah. As the film's Mexican-American directors Pascual Gutierrez and R.J. Sanchez, otherwise known as Clica, put it, quote, "It's crazy to see these ideas that we came up with actually happening. As in a hotel elevator that makes Cornejo underwater to sing with a mermaid played by Maria Sordoya from the Marias, as his fish besties nod along." So it's got, like, some animated elements to it, or character elements, obviously. Just cool, man. I love people being able to do their creative stuff. I love being, you know, seeing our culture and the various aspects of it being put out there by big companies, and people being able to get a check from this, people being able to bring attention to their art, and for us to be able to see ourselves more and more, I think is amazing. So definitely going to go and check this out when I get a chance to sit down and watch it. Again, it's via Apple, and it's called Suerte. I think it's 12, like a 12-minute short film, so obviously an easy watch. Easy for all of us to go out and support. Now, with that said, I want to get y'all's take on one of the stories we talked about today, and we'll do it in our Ask a Gringo segment.
Ask a Gringo! I have a question.
All right, so for this Ask a Gringo segment, I want to cover the Biden dropout and Kamala being the presumptive Democratic nominee for president. Or I should say the candidate for the Democratic Party for president in 2024 this year. And I simply just asked thoughts on Biden out and Kamala in. I got a bunch of responses. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can here. Let's see. At Cali.boy.auth says, "I hope she brings some much needed heat to the debates. #FDT. Same. I think she's going to, if Donald Trump even shows up for a debate and doesn't try to get his way out of it, I think she's going to wash the floor with him in a way that Biden wasn't capable of. And she's going to put her experience as a high-level attorney, prosecutor, to good use. I mean, she's already been on, like, the campaign trail talking about how, like, going at this dude like she should. He's a convicted felon. She made a career of going after convicted felons. He is somebody who was found liable in civil court for sexual misconduct. She's made a point of going after people who commit sexual crimes, right? So she's gone at him in that way already. And I just can't see how he could have even hold a torch to her on a debate stage, honestly. So it is exciting, and I think that another reason why people are fired up is like we don't have to sit through another debate like that last one, which is fucking Jesus bad. At you ain't _Tati says, we are fucked either way with the peace emoji. Respectfully, I disagree. I think I first want to say I get why people might feel disenfranchised as a whole, particularly if you are one of the many, many, many people in this country who are struggling to really find like solid footing, right? I get it. And quite honestly, I personally get really mad sometimes and frustrated about the state of the country and where we are as a society. I was reading a book the other day, while driving. I was listening to the audio version of a book that was kind of talking about sort of everything that has gone into making kind of this world that we live in today, this ultra-capitalistic world. And I found myself getting really frustrated. I had to turn off the book, actually, because I was just getting annoyed and angry. So I get feeling disenfranchised. With that said, sort of checking out and not participating or just sort of saying whatever, we're screwed either way, I don't see how that's going to get you where you want to be, right? I talk about this a lot. It's like we take the hands that we're dealt in life and then we have to act accordingly. If we are unhappy with circumstance, it's up to us to take some sort of action to try and push back on that circumstance. It's not always easy. It's not always a direct thing that we can change right then and there, but we still do have a choice. You sort of checking out and not voting, not caring, or not taking your time to sort of hear where Kamala would potentially be standing on issues that you care about, you're not participating in the system that you're a part of, whether you want to be a part of it or not. And I say this with love. By not participating, you don't deserve a seat at the table. You don't deserve to complain. Right? It's kind of like you ever go on vacation with people or whatever, like you plan a night out with your friends, and I end up being the planner a lot of times. I'm like the idea guy. So I'll plan the whole night out and like, all right, we're going out, blah, blah, blah. And of course, sometimes you go and like things don't go according to plan. The bar you plan on going to, the club, it's kind of a dud. It's like a dead night for whatever reason, right? Or the restaurant you planned on, the food wasn't as good as you hoped. Or like something happened on vacation, didn't go as planned, blah, blah, blah. And then there's that one person that has the nerve, when they literally were like a passenger princess on the entire process, has the nerve to complain when they did absolutely nothing and contributed nothing and they just showed up. That's essentially what you become when you choose not to participate in the process of a democracy, i.e. voting for your elected officials. That's what you become. And I think we all can agree, if you've experienced people like that in your family or your friends, after you've, taken it upon yourself to try and plan things out for everybody and they have the nerve to complain, it's frustrating. And really, whether you tell them or not, you're kind of like, then you fucking plan it next time, right? I'm sure we all said that out loud. Then you tell us what you want to do. And they never have an answer because they just want to complain about things. But that's who you become when you don't participate at the end of the day. And I implore you to have your voice heard, because there are people who have died for that right, for us each to have our voice heard. And on top of it, there are people who are going through a very long and difficult process just to have that right, right? Those who are immigrating here and going through the process of becoming citizens, they're spending a lot of time, money, and energy just to have that same basic right that many of us were born into or currently have. And if it's really a shame for us to not appreciate that privilege and to not make use of it. All right, last one here. At @cross_soul says, I'm hoping they let others get a shot. She got no votes last time. Yang gang all the way. And I touched on this, I know, earlier a little bit about kind of where we are in the process, and we're kind of in like a very consolidated campaign trail. And the smartest tactic is to get behind who has the most momentum and the strongest candidate from that angle, and it's Kamala Harris. Again, I know that's a bit frustrating, especially if you're a fan of other people. You mentioned someone like Andrew Yang. Who, to be honest, I was an Andrew Yang fan, when he first made his presidential run. But, I mean, in the scope of the conversation, he's somebody who didn't get the votes, right? He ran for mayor of New York City and lost. And actually got his ass whooped. He wasn't even one of the top people. And I want him to be mayor of New York. Technically, I'm not a resident of New York, so I couldn't vote in that one. But I would have if I still lived in New York. So I to a degree, I get what you're saying. I think, again, we are in an unfortunate situation where it's like us versus democracy, and we need to ride the hot hand. And that is Kamala Harris. And I understand, again, the argument that in 2020 she couldn't even, beat out some of her other competitors. But that was like 4 years. That was legitimately 4 years ago. 4 years ago, quite honestly, I was living paycheck to paycheck. So I don't know about where you were, but I was in a very different place 4 years ago. I'm a very different person. I've learned a lot since then. I'd imagine the same is true for her. Having gone through that experience, then having been vice president under a very experienced politician in Joe Biden, her energy feels completely different than it did in 2020. The clarity of her campaign, I think the marketing, the tactics we've seen already in just the last week, she gets it now, I think. And I think that's the difference. And I think as a whole, we have to look at it as, look how energized people are. And yes, part of that could be just because they were so de-energized by the idea of Trump versus Biden that literally anybody could step in there and it's more exciting and we feel like, life is worth living again. But I also think there is something to the fact that, again, the woman has raised $126 million in the last week, 81 million of it being in just the first 24 hours of her being announced as the favorite or being endorsed by Biden after him dropping out. You got to go where the momentum is. And she has people talking about this upcoming election in a way that wasn't being spoken about just last week. People are excited once again. They are energized. Memes are going off in a good way rather than a negative way, as we saw with Biden. I really think this is good. And again, I've said this, she wasn't my first choice. But I really do think she is the best choice right now. The momentum she has. And quite honestly, I know everybody's like, oh, it's identity politics because she's a black woman, blah, blah. She is an incredibly successful person prior to this. Right? She is not just somebody who was pulled up out of nowhere. She's a successful prosecutor. Again, Attorney General of California at one point, right? Like, I think we're ignoring so much of her accomplishments and demeaning them based on really nothing. Again, she was senator. And then she was the fucking vice president. I mean, nobody was questioning, Al Gore's capability of becoming president after Bill Clinton, when he was vice president. Like, it's just sort of what happens, right? If the vice president in a normal campaign cycle is sort of going to always be the favorite if the past president hasn't isn't running for re-election or can't because they've served an 8-year term. And no, obviously Biden didn't work out for him in obviously in the 2016 election, but I just think we're discrediting her unnecessarily when she really does have a great deal of credentials. And I understand you may want somebody else, or the argument of, she wasn't a strong candidate in 2020. But again, 4 years changes a lot. And I don't think she wasn't a strong candidate because she wasn't qualified. Much of the conversation, if you really dive into like people who have analyzed that campaign, they feel like she never had clear messaging, right? And that is more so about strategy of running the campaign rather than qualifications. Because let's be honest, also, it's not simply about who's best for the job. It's also a popularity contest of who you can, who people like and see themselves in or feel like gets them, right? It's not always just qualifications. I mean, it really never is. If it was, Donald Trump wouldn't have become president of the United States. So I think we have to keep all of that in mind when talking about this stuff. But again, we're all entitled to feel how we feel. I think, again, just greater vision of it all. Understand what's at risk here, what's at stake, and sort of allow that to be a bit of your compass and your North Star, if you will. That'd be my opinion, my take, or my advice for anybody. With that said, thank you all so much for participating in that conversation at DJ Dramos on Instagram if you want to be a part of these conversations. And with that said, let's tie everything we talked about today in a neat little bow in a segment we call Conclusion Stew.
Time for Conclusion Stew.
All right, so this episode I know is running, I think, a little bit long. So I have dove into everything. The Biden dropping out, Kamala coming in. I'm ecstatic. I genuinely felt a sense of relief when it was announced. And I think the general excitement and energy around this election, the momentum has shifted in favor of the Democrats. And I think because of that, you have to ride with Kamala. And again, she's a qualified candidate. This isn't somebody who was pulled out of obscurity. I think we really have to get rid of that narrative. That is a narrative of the other side. They're trying to push that shit. And, it's just not real. It's not based on reality. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind here, right? Now, this really tragic story in Illinois with Sonia Macy, a black woman losing her life at the hands of a police officer unnecessarily. Again, it's a horrendous situation. On one hand, you have the officer being held accountable very quickly, being held without bond, so he's sitting in a jail right now, as he should be. Was fired right away when the indictment came down. So on one hand, that's progress. I think, again, when you compare it to something like George Floyd's murder, where it took months and it took the video being leaked onto the internet, and the perfect storm of us sitting at home in COVID for anybody to be held accountable for that. So again, that's progress right there. On the flip side of it, the fact that this is still an issue, the fact that this is such an egregious overuse of power and negligence on the hands of this former police officer, Sean Grayson, showcases there's still a glaring issue in this country of lack of training, lack of quality police officers, and probably underlying racism as well, if we're being honest here. So on that hand, it's very disheartening, but it's a stark reminder that there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to keep talking about it and keep applying pressure, because the worst thing we could do is become numb to these things and sort of normalize them happening, which I would hate to obviously see. And then on some positivity, man, love seeing artists from our community getting their shine. Apple's new short film Suerte is really just a great concept, I think, and just exciting to see more and more of our voices being propped up there and showcased. Well-deserving people of that. I think it's amazing. So I'm gonna go and definitely support this, and it's inspiring. Again, the fact they shot this on an iPhone, like, it's like, dude, it's you versus you. There's nothing holding you back. You have to just go out there and fucking do the idea that's in your head. There's a means to an end. If you really want it, you're gonna figure out a way to do it, even if it means shooting it on your phone. So just think about that. And that's it, man. Thank y'all so much for tuning in. Crazy, crazy times that we are living in. That's all I really could say about it. Again, the new Just Be Social Club, free subscription. My mastermind group that I'm leading. You're looking for inspiration in your life, whatever it might be, man. Like, you want to feel like you're a part of something. It's an extension of this. It's a way for all of us to connect. Just DM me at DJ Dramos. You could just say Just Be Social Club, and I'll send you the link to join the community. And that's it. I'll catch you on Tuesday with a brand new episode. Till then, stay safe, and we'll talk soon. Peace.